Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us in our conversation with Kelsey Zlevor about mental landscapes. Uh, my name is Leo Vasquez. I'm the executive director of the Northern New Jersey Community Foundation, and we're so excited to be talking with Kelsey today about some exciting work that she is doing, and also hope that this encourages you to join us next week when Kelsey will be doing a workshop in Teaneck on designing places to reduce depression. Uh, Now, Kelsey and I are both planners and placemakers, and in our world, we talk a lot about designing places to improve health. And usually that conversation is about physical health, keeping people active, encouraging them to walk and run, etc., which is great. But very, but it one thing that's often not talked about is designing places to improve mental health, places that could be healing spaces for people who are suffering from psychological disabilities like depression. And Kelsey Zlevor is has been doing some great work around that. And so what I'd like to do is talk with her today about her work, and hopefully if there's time, you can ask questions as well. So Kelsey, welcome to the program. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll ask you questions about your work.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and really looking forward to next week and doing the workshop with all of you and anyone who's able to attend. I'm currently located in Chicago. I work for Muse Community and Design here in the city. I've been in consulting and planning consulting for what's now going to be about 8 years. I've worked at a number of other firms across the US. I was in Oregon for a number of years. I recently just moved back to Chicago, but my background, my undergrad's in environmental science and my master's in urban planning. So it's been really cool to kind of use this work as well to marry both of those interests.
Great, thank you. And we're going to mention this a couple of times. Your website is
Yes, it's my first and last name, kelseyslavor.com. And I have my website that actually is going to be updated, hopefully coming now into the new year. So some things are a little out of date, but that's where I normally keep my kind of portfolio of work and what I'm up to. So.
great. Okay, well, can you tell us a little bit about mental landscapes? How did this come about, and why did you create it?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. That is really the origin story for sure is a big motivator for the work itself, which is that yeah, I was living by myself during a majority of the pandemic lockdown. I was still living in Oregon at the time. I was on reduced hours for work, and so essentially so much of kind of my social and just the infrastructure that I was often using normally to really kind of control or manage any depressive symptoms I had had previously. Things got exponentially worse during the lockdown for me because of living in isolation and all of these things. And I began going to a park every day near my house in Eugene, Oregon, when the weather was nice. And I was using that park every day as kind of just like the outlet and the space that I would go to leave my house. And I started noticing from that experience that kind of how I was feeling would really interpret or shape the way that I was intaking and kind of perceiving stimuli, even if it was the same stimuli that I was seeing over and over again, right? Like it was a space that was really familiar to me. And yet I was finding that kind of who I was or how I was feeling would shape the way I would understand that space on different days. And given that I was working in planning consulting at the time, specifically in parks consulting, park design work, I started wondering if this could really possibly be true, that who we are and who we are when we enter a space shapes our understanding and perception of that space, especially from like kind of a mental or psychological level. And I wasn't finding really anyone who was asking that question or really poking at it, especially in the park design world, in the way that I was really interested in and that I wanted to dig into. And so I really just launched the project from like a grassroots personal interest. And it's been really cool to see then how it started resonating with people. And I think there's a lot of room to grow it. So
So you talk about something called spatial integrity. What is that, and why is it important to know?
Yeah, that's a piece on my website. I appreciate you bringing that up. I feel like I don't often have a chance to talk about it, but it really stemmed from again work I was doing during the pandemic and just like thinking about my professional life and what, the type of work I want to do and how I want to do it. And I began thinking about and like conceiving of planning and design projects from this thing that I've been calling spatial integrity, which is this idea of like being in right relationship when we're doing these design projects. So that's like being in right relationship with other people, being in right relationship with history, even understanding kind of like the history of the spaces. Are we on indigenous land? What does that mean? Where are we practicing? And then being in right relationship to the future, thinking about climate change and what are some of these spaces going to look like moving forward. And so it's really just a big kind of umbrella. It's nebulous, but it's a big umbrella concept that I've been trying to use to think about just how I practice and how I do planning projects, in order to again put more of this understanding of what it means to practice with integrity and to be doing work that is truly serving people in equitable ways.
Yeah, and I'm asking the question, just so everybody knows, I'm asking the question because how we approach a problem or an issue really frames what we can do about it. I mean, it kind of
Mhm.
boxes us in it or allows us
Mm.
to expand our thinking. And in that vein, um, the way a lot of us planners, we come in and we say, okay, we're going to do the demographic analysis, we'll do spatial analysis. Then we go to people and we say, oh, what do you want to see here? That's kind of the standard planner architect question. But you take somewhat a different approach and you talk about being self-reflective and political moral inquiry. So I was wondering if you could talk about that approach to these issues and how that might differ from the way, it's usually done by a lot of our peers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I think the way I think about this, and I agree with you, I was finding just in practice that it was a lot of, what do we put where, right? And like kind of asking these more like physical element questions, which not to say that's not important, and that certainly serves a place, and there's a reason we do that. And it felt like there was like a layer or a dimension missing to the way that for me of how we think about and do design, which again was very much informed by my mental health experience during the pandemic. And that was to really begin kind of adding this layer to the way that we do design and asking like, how do people feel? But like how is this like landing in our bodies when we go into these spaces, and can we think and design from that place as well, which I think is fundamentally a more feminist lens for how we practice and do design. And certainly there's, I understand that there's a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened, because it's hard. It's messy. It feels squishy. It feels hard to quantify people's feelings, and in some cases we shouldn't quantify people's feelings, right? It's very qualitative. However, I think going back to that like political moral piece, I come back to like there are so many forces that are often acting, not only on the sites but on the people that are using the sites and are populating the sites. And so when we think about, histories of racism and histories of poverty and all of these kind of like big what feel like nebulous topics, I think unless we're thinking about that with how we are walking into and understanding place and place making, if we're not doing that, I feel like the profession isn't evolving. And so that has been, I think, kind of a driving force for all of this work as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I share your thoughts. I mean, I often tell people that, those of us in the place field, placemakers, planners, architects, we're taught to think in nouns, but the way most people think
Mm,
about places is in adjectives, you know. So,
yes.
another term that you use, I think is that I'm really interested about is the term psychological disability.
Mm.
Uh, can you talk about why you use the language of disability and how, what why you use that term, you know?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few things to that, and I'm glad we're talking about this too, because I think it's really important. Ultimately, I am not a disability scholar. I have friends who are or are working to become those people, and I'll be the first to admit I'm not a disability scholar, and I've been doing my own work to really become knowledgeable and learn more about so much work that's been happening way before my time, just around disability rights and activism. And I think especially kind of even what we were talking about earlier with design, that there's been this assumption or this kind of tendency to think of disability as being really visible and being really physical. And there's been, I think, a lot of movement over the last few years around invisible disabilities. And so just because you can't see someone maybe using a mobility device or something similar doesn't mean that they don't have a disability. And there's also been, I think, this push where disability has historically been a very stigmatizing word, that we, assume it's bad and that there's these negative connotations, or that we've perpetuated a model where like something's wrong with that person. And I think a lot of what I have been trying to do with this work as well is by naming depression as a psychological disability, which it is because it's an invisible disability that's happening mentally. It's also trying to destigmatize that, or keep in mind that like that is a format of what it is, where if it's altering your day-to-day life and it's making it difficult to be able to participate in kind of structures as they currently exist, right? For in whatever ways kind of your depression can manifest. I fundamentally think in some cases, it certainly can be classified as a very huge disability. And that's not the case for everybody. But I think I have been really interested in trying to think about how we add that, again, more unseen layer of disability into the conversation, and how we talk about that just as much as we, talk about curb cuts and things for, when we think about physical disability and wheelchairs, and that this is, again, kind of like a burgeoning piece to that puzzle that I think we need to continue talking about.
So this is great. Why don't we get to what I think a lot of people are probably wondering about is what are you learning about designing places to address psychological disabilities like depression?
Yeah, there's a lot, which I am very excited to share with everybody next week at the conference. But I would say probably two of my biggest takeaways, I guess the first would be that people actually really know a lot more about their emotional kind of like interiority and how they understand space. And we just don't talk about it. We don't provide enough inroads for people to communicate that. And it's not always going to be verbal, which is why I think like the workshop that I do is so fascinating. It's like a really creative hands-on way for people to articulate these things that I think especially us in like Western US culture aren't really trained to talk about or think about, our feelings, and especially as adults, kind of how we move through the world in this really emotional way. And so I think the first one is this, like, people know a lot more than they think they do, or like there's a lot more insight that people have to offer. And oftentimes we just haven't, I think your analogy about the questions, or your comment about the questions, the way we frame questions is a great analogy. And like the way we frame processes is going to yield us certain results, and which is why I've been interested in different processes to yield these different results. I think the second piece then would also be that, and where I am like the most heartened, is so much of what I end up getting or hearing from people when we're talking about designing for depression ends up just being these like really fundamental and or beautiful components that are good for everybody. Like it's this idea that like if we're designing for this specific, disability, or this specific category of a psychological disability, it's actually stuff that benefits everybody, whether or not you're going through a depressive episode. And I think that has been what feels really lasting. And I think where again, there's just like so much more to poke at. And I think, yeah, given both of those things, this is definitely like a lifetime project, right? Because the more we dig into it, I think the more we're gonna see. So.
Yeah, and I really like the fact that you said that this benefits everybody, because not everybody suffers from depression, but everybody has moments or times when they
Sure.
do have that, feel depressed in some way, even if
Yep.
it's clinical depression. And this also connects to the workshop and conference next week on January 11th in Teaneck, about loneliness because of the connections between depression and social isolation.
Correct.
So the one thing I'm also excited about is in your workshop is you're going to be showing the participants ways to engage people about how they can tell their stories and become collaborators and co-designers of spaces. Could you talk a little bit about what you're going to be talking about in terms of that community engagement?
Yeah, sure. So, the kind of the workshop piece, I'll be doing a session during the day that's obviously just focused on kind of the research I've been doing, the framework that I've kind of been developing from all of that research. But then the workshop is really kind of that times two, where then we're gonna, take that research, take that body of work, take that framework, and then start thinking about like, okay, so then how do we take this and like talk to people, and how do we take that and how do we build processes kind of knowing what we know now, what does that look like to like run a design process, at least initially through this like first lens or like through this first round of thinking. And I've had actually I was very fortunate earlier this year that I got an artist residency for 3 weeks in Central Illinois, where I was actually practicing all of this workshop, essentially what I'm going to be doing in New Jersey. I was doing that at a park and retreat center in Illinois that is like a very like beloved local community gem, and so we were using mental landscapes on this very specific park site to talk to people and better understand, how they interpret that site when they're experiencing their depressive symptoms. And so it was, again, just like really amazing, really enlightening. And so I'm very excited to share it with people next week and have more conversations around it.
And one of the things you told me as you were telling me about the workshop is that it's not something in terms of designing these spaces. It's not just a simple like if this then that. Just it's not
Correct.
like a list of things and always have this. It's more of an art to it, right? I mean,
Mm,
could you talk a little bit about why is it why is this something that doesn't just lend itself to just some very simple strategies like, oh, put brightly colored benches.
sure. No, I appreciate that question a lot. And that's been at the top of mind as well, because I feel like there's this really interesting kind of cultural tension right now around like, oh my God, depression, oh my God, loneliness, how do we solve it yesterday? And there's this like urgency, there's this rush of like, oh my God, what do we need to do to make this go away? Or what do we need to do to make this better? And fundamentally, the irony is that I think that like rush and that sense of trying to make decisions really quick or like implement things really quickly is kind of also what got us here, or kind of like gotten us to this place that not everything has necessarily been as intentional as it could be. And so I think the way that I approach this work and what I hope to do with the workshop is I try and frame so much of the research and my findings as questions. And it's really about and more specific design questions. And those questions then become the baseline that communities talk within and to each other to make decisions that are best for that specific site in that specific community. And again, I think because mental health is fundamentally so nuanced and there are so many forces that are acting on each different person's mental health, that to suggest that there's this one-stop shop suite of tools or things that we could do would be really, I think, to like cheapen and do a disservice for what mental health is and how we talk about it. And so again, like I come back to an example where if we're talking about designing for ease, right, which is like one of the elements that I think about and I'll talk about with my work, my sense of ease as a white woman who doesn't use a mobility device, who has financial means, is going to maybe look or feel very differently from someone who maybe isn't an English speaker, has a different skin tone than me, and is in a rural community. Or there's these, right, that there's all these
Mhm.
different layers that we need to think about and understand and frankly, I think like grapple with. And so that's why I actually, it is very purposeful that my that my work isn't clear cut in some ways, because it's going to take everyone in that community or in that neighborhood or around that specific site that we're discussing to come together and have conversation about like what does a collective vision for this space look like given these community elements or community demographics. So
Great. Okay. One thing, is we've got a few minutes here. Um, so I just want to ask something else here. What has surprised you in your research?
mm, I think that there are fundamentally elements that have now come up multiple times, like really organically, with people that it's almost surprised me that so many people have kind of said the same thing. So, for example, and I'll talk about this more next week, but one of those pieces is like how much people reference water, that being near water is fundamentally just really soothing, really helpful. And and also how much people dislike park benches. Specifically this like wanting to kind of linger in spaces, wanting to feel like you can sit and relax and that not every activity that you're doing is physical. So, or physical recreation. So I think there a big piece that's been interesting has been, at least for me, like rethinking parks as a place of rest and relaxation. And like, what does it mean to create spaces where people feel welcome to sit and read or sit and craft outside with their friends? Or like, again, for people who don't have backyards, just like having places to, I think, leisurely rest and how and even some of like how that is in then direct conflict or direct tension in how I think cities and sometimes institutions think about like unhoused people in public spaces, right? That if we're designing for comfort, that means people are going to loiter or that means people are going to linger. And what does it mean to like shift culture around public spaces for kind of those reasons? So again, I'm very like fresh to thinking about all of that, but that's stuff that's been kind of percolating for me.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Kelsey. So Kelsey Zlevor is going to be doing the workshop Designing Places to Reduce Depression at Fairleigh Dickinson University on January 11th from 1:30 to 4 p.m. And that's in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is up in Bergen County.
Yes.
And you can register for that workshop at the Northern New Jersey Community Foundation's website, which is nnjcf.org. So, Kelsey, thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see many of you next week. So, thank you, Kelsey.
No, thank you for having me. This was so great, and I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody in person next week.